She was standing at the kitchen counter with her back to me, and I was pretending to read the label on a paint can I had already read twice. The late afternoon light was coming through the window above the sink, and it caught the side of her face in a way that made me feel like I had wandered into a moment that did not belong to me. The apartment still smelled like fresh drywall and cardboard. There were boxes stacked along the wall behind her, a coffee maker she had not unplugged yet sitting on the counter beside an empty mug. She turned around and looked at me, and for a second neither of us said anything. Then she picked up a small photograph from the counter, the kind you print at a drugstore, and held it out to me. "I've been carrying this since before you and Melissa were together," she said. "I just thought you should know." I stood there holding a paint can and a photograph I was not ready to look at, and everything I thought I understood about the last 3 years rearranged itself all at once. It started 7 months earlier on a Sunday evening in March, when my phone rang and the name on the screen was one I hadn't seen since Melissa and I separated. "My name is Grant Holloway. I'm 38 years old and I work as a site supervisor for a mid-size residential construction company based out of Kitchener, Ontario. It's not glamorous work. I manage subcontractors, read blueprints, walk half-finished houses in steel-toed boots, and fill out safety reports that nobody reads until something goes wrong. I drive a 2019 Ford F-150 with a cracked mud flap on the passenger side that I keep meaning to replace. I've been meaning to replace it for about a year and a half. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in the Waterloo region after my separation from Melissa. We had been together for 5 years, married for 2 of them, no kids. The separation wasn't dramatic in any way that would make a good story. Melissa sat down across from me one night at the dinner table and told me that she felt like she was always standing just outside a room where the lights were on and I was inside, and she could never quite figure out how to get through the door. She said it quietly and without accusation, the way you describe the weather in a city you're leaving. I didn't argue because I didn't know how to. I just said, "Okay," and we started figuring out the logistics. I didn't hate her for it. I still don't. She was describing something real. I know that. I've always known it. After the separation, I went back to the rhythms that had always made sense to me. Up at 5:30, site by 7, home by 6 if I was lucky, later if I wasn't. I cooked simple food, the kind that doesn't require much attention, pasta, stir-fry, whatever I could put together without looking at a recipe. I watched hockey on weeknights, read paperbacks on weekends, fix things in the apartment that weren't broken enough to complain about, but weren't quite right either. A bathroom tap that dripped, a drawer that stuck, a towel bar that had been slightly crooked since the day I moved in and bothered me every single morning. I wasn't unhappy. I wasn't anything dramatic. I had just gotten used to the particular shape of a life lived alone. Melissa's younger sister Brooke was someone I had seen maybe a dozen times over the years. She was 3 years younger than Melissa, which put her at 32. She lived in Halifax, where she worked as a landscape architect for a firm that did commercial and institutional projects. She was the quieter of the 2 sisters in a way that wasn't shy exactly, more self-contained. While Melissa filled a room the way she filled everything, loudly and completely and without really meaning to, Brooke had a tendency to settle somewhere near the edge of things. At holiday dinners, she would find the chair that was slightly removed from the table, the one nobody else wanted. She asked questions more than she answered them. She listened in a way that most people don't, the kind of listening where you can feel that the other person is actually storing what you say rather than just waiting for their turn to speak. After the separation, Brooke disappeared from my life the same way everyone on Melissa's side did. It wasn't anyone's fault. That's just how it works. You don't stay in touch with your ex-wife's family because there's no architecture for it. No socially legible reason to send a text or pick up the phone. So you don't, and eventually the contact fades the way things do when nobody is actively maintaining them. Then, on a Sunday evening in March, my phone rang. The number was a 902 area code, which I didn't recognize right away. When I picked up, the voice on the other end was careful and a little formal, like someone walking on ice they're not sure will hold. "Grant, it's Brooke. Melissa's sister. I'm sorry to call out of nowhere." I told her it was fine and asked what was going on. She explained that she had accepted a position with a firm in Cambridge, Ontario, and was relocating from Halifax. She needed help moving some things into a new apartment, and she didn't know anyone in the area. She said she had thought about hiring movers, but most of her furniture wasn't coming with her anyway. Just boxes, Books mostly, kitchen things. She said, I know it's a strange ask, you don't have to say yes. I thought about it for about 4 seconds. There was nothing complicated in her voice, no angle I could detect. She needed a hand, I had a truck, and that was more or less the extent of it, so I said yes. The drive to Halifax wasn't something I could do in a day, so we arranged it differently. Brooke had already rented a cube van for the long haul and was driving it herself. She just needed someone to meet her in Cambridge with a truck and help her get boxes up to a third-floor walk-up once she arrived, because the building had no elevator. I drove down to Cambridge on a Saturday in April, a gray morning, with the kind of clouds that can't commit to rain but won't give you anything better either. Her new apartment was on the 3rd floor of a converted older building near the Grand River. When I got there, she was already parked out front, cube van pulled up to the curb, sitting on the bumper with a coffee in both hands like she was rationing warmth. She stood up when she saw my truck and raised one coffee in my direction. There's a second one in the van, she said. Black. I didn't know if that was still right. I thought about that for a second. The only time she could have known how I took my coffee was from years of weekend visits, watching me pour it at Melissa's kitchen counter. That was a small detail to carry across 3 years of no contact. Still right, I said. We carried boxes up the stairs for 2 hours. She had packed light, the way someone packs when they've decided not to carry the past with them but also haven't quite figured out what to replace it with. A few boxes of books, neatly labeled in black marker, kitchen essentials, 2 small lamps, a drafting table she cared about more than anything else, which we had to angle sideways through the stairwell landing and almost didn't make it. She directed me without telling me what to do, which sounds like a contradiction but isn't. She just said left a bit and that corner first, and somehow I always knew what she meant. By the time we got the last box up, it was early afternoon. She made coffee on the stove in a small pot that looked like it had come from someone's grandmother's kitchen, dented and dark from use, and we sat on the floor of the living room because there was nowhere else to sit yet. Outside the window, the Grand River moved slowly behind the bare April trees. We talked more easily than I expected, easier than we ever had when Melissa was in the room. Brooke asked about work. I told her about the subdivision we were building out near Elmira, the timeline problems, the subcontractor who kept showing up without the right materials. She listened without pretending to care more than she did, which I appreciated. I asked about the new job. She said it was a good firm, mostly municipal work, some hospital grounds. She said she had always wanted to work somewhere with actual winters, because winter landscaping was more interesting than people gave it credit for. I told her I had never thought about it. She said most people hadn't. We drove in comfortable silence back toward Cambridge for a late lunch at a diner on Water Street, the kind of place with laminated menus and coffee that comes out of a glass pot. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't supposed to be. It felt right in the way simple things feel right when you're not trying to make them into anything. Over the next few weeks, I found reasons to stop by. There was always something that needed doing in the apartment, things she hadn't gotten around to yet. A towel bar that needed anchoring properly, a curtain rod in the bedroom that the previous tenant had installed crooked. I brought over a drill one afternoon and fixed a cabinet hinge that was pulling away from the frame. I didn't announce that I was doing it. I just noticed it, fixed it, and moved on, which is how I've always operated. She watched me work without comment, and when I put the drill away, she made tea the way she always did, in a small ceramic pot with a hairline crack along the spout. We fell into a rhythm that I didn't examine too closely, because it seemed fragile in the way good things sometimes are, the kind of thing that collapses if you look at it directly. She knew things about me that she shouldn't have been able to know, not from so few interactions. She knew I measured twice before marking anything, that I always tested a hinge before declaring it fixed, that I drank the second half of my coffee cold without minding. These were not things you pick up from a few holiday dinners. These were things you pick up from paying attention over a long period of time, to someone you weren't supposed to be paying attention to. I noticed this the way you notice a sound you can't quite identify, something at the edge of hearing that you can't dismiss once you've registered it. One evening we were sitting on her small balcony above the river. It was May by then, warm enough to be outside if you had a sweater, cold enough that you were glad you had one. She had a manuscript in her lap, something she was reviewing for a colleague, and I had a coffee going cold in my hand and was looking at the way the light was sitting on the water. She looked over at me without lifting her face from the page and said quietly, Do you ever think about the version of things where the timing was different? I asked her what she meant. She shook her head slightly. Nothing, just a thought. I let it go. I told myself she was thinking about her move, about Halifax, about the job she had left. I told myself she was speaking in the abstract the way people do on quiet evenings when they've had one cup of tea too many. I was probably right, I thought. I filed it away and didn't take it out again. Not then. A month later I was helping her sort through a closet in the hallway of her apartment, the kind of deep closet that becomes a catch-all in the first weeks after a move. Behind a rolled-up yoga mat and a box of winter gear she hadn't put away yet, I found a small shoebox without a lid. Inside were photographs. Printed ones, the kind you get developed at a London Drugs or a Shoppers, and they were of places in Ontario. Elora, the Cambridge Mill Pond, the Elmira Mennonite Market, places she had no obvious reason to have visited, given that she had been living in Halifax. Before I could look more closely, she reached past me and lifted the box out of my hand. Not roughly, but quickly. "Old stuff," she said. Her voice was steady, but something underneath it wasn't. "Doesn't matter." I didn't push. But the question stayed with me the way questions do when you can feel they have an answer that matters. Why would someone who had lived in Halifax for 6 years have a shoebox full of photographs of small towns in Ontario? Towns that were, more or less, within an hour of where I lived and worked? I didn't ask. I should have, maybe. But I didn't. What I did do was start paying closer attention to the small things. The way she always had the right kind of coffee in the apartment even though she drank tea. The way she knew that I preferred a flathead screwdriver to a Robertson for certain jobs, which is a preference so specific that even people I've worked with for years don't know it. The way she had once casually mentioned the name of the subdivision I was working on before I had told her which project I was on. I started to feel like I was reading a book where all the footnotes were written for someone else, but I was the only one in the room. The moment everything changed came on a Tuesday evening in October. I was in my apartment, reading when my phone lit up. The name on the screen was Melissa. Her voice when I picked up was clipped and exact, the way it got when she had made a decision before making a call. No greeting, just, "What's going on with you and Brooke?" I explained the same way I had explained to myself. I had helped her move, stopped by a few times. She needed help getting settled, that was all. Melissa made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Grant, come on. Brooke has always had a thing for projects she can't have. She did it in high school, she did it in university, she fixates, she always has." Then she told me something she framed as concern. She said that years ago, Brooke had gotten attached to a man who was in a relationship, had let it go too far, had caused problem. She said it like a warning label on a product she was genuinely worried I'd misuse. But I had known Melissa for 5 years. I knew how she constructed information. I knew the difference between the shape of concern and the shape of control. She wasn't worried about me. She was worried about the story, about what it meant for her narrative of the marriage if Brooke, the quiet one, the one who sat in the corner at dinner, was the person I eventually moved toward. It would mean something she didn't want it to mean. I said I understood and got off the phone. But it worked a little. I hate admitting that. It worked the way a slow puncture works. You don't notice it right away, but the next morning something is different. The next time I went to Brooke's apartment I was slightly different. I fixed the thing she had texted me about, a loose electrical plate in the kitchen that was pulling away from the wall. I stayed maybe 40 minutes. I found a reason to leave before the tea was ready, something about an early site walkthrough. I was careful not to be obvious about it, but she noticed. She always noticed everything. She didn't say anything. She didn't ask what was wrong or try to bridge the space I was quietly putting between us. She just went a little still, the way a person goes still when they recognize something they've felt before and had hoped they wouldn't feel again. Melissa arrived in Cambridge 3 weeks later. She hadn't told either of us. She drove up from Guelph on a Saturday afternoon and knocked on Brooke's door. I happened to be there, installing a weather strip on the balcony door that had been letting in a draft since October. When Brooke opened the door and saw her sister standing in the hallway, something went out of her face immediately. She took a step back, and Melissa came in the way she always came into rooms, first, and with purpose. The three of us stood in the living room, with the afternoon light coming through the windows and the faint sound of the river below and a very particular kind of silence that has weight to it. Melissa turned to Brooke and her voice was even and precise. She said, "Tell him. Go ahead, Brooke. Tell Grant that you've had feelings for him since before he and I were ever together. Tell him that you took this job in Cambridge of all the cities in Ontario because it puts you 20 minutes from where he lives. Tell him that you didn't hire movers because you wanted a reason to call him. Every word was true. I understood that immediately, and I think I had understood it for some time, the way you understand something before you let yourself know it. Brooke didn't move. She looked at the floor. The silence stretched long enough to fill every corner of the room and still have some left over. Then she looked up at her sister and said, very quietly, "You're not wrong, but you're not saying it right either." She turned to me. She didn't defend herself. She didn't try to contextualize what Melissa had said or soften it or spin it in a direction that was easier to receive. She apologized for not being honest from the beginning, not for the feelings, but for letting me walk into something without knowing the full picture. Her voice was steady, in the way that things are steady when they've had a long time to settle. Then she crossed the room to her drafting table. She picked up a photograph that was lying face down on the surface and placed it on the kitchen counter between us. I looked at it. It was a photograph of a job site, not just any job site. It was the residential subdivision I had worked on 3 years ago, the one out near Elmira. You could see the framing of 3 houses in the background, bare wood against a gray November sky. In the foreground, with his back half turned to the camera, was a man in a high-vis vest and a hard hat, looking at something off to the right of the frame. It was me. I recognized the vest the way I was standing. I hadn't known anyone was taking it. I looked up at Brooke. "I drove out there one afternoon," she said. She didn't look away. Melissa had mentioned the project. I didn't plan anything, I just drove out. And I took one photograph, and I went home and I told myself that was the last time I was going to do anything that stupid. She had driven from wherever she was, at whatever point in her life she was at, to take one photograph of a man who didn't know she was there. And she had kept it face down on her drafting table since the day she moved in the spot where she would see it every morning without having to explain it to anyone. Melissa turned to me. I knew exactly what she wanted. She had made a long drive, and she wanted it to mean something. She wanted me to look at the photograph and look at Brooke and confirm that this was exactly what she had said it was. Fixation, a pattern, something that should concern me. She stood with her arms crossed and her chin slightly raised, waiting. I looked at the photograph for a long time. Then I looked at Melissa and I said, "You didn't come here to protect me. You came here because you needed this to be something it isn't." She opened her mouth, then closed it. I said, "Brooke made choices I didn't know about. That's between her and me. It's not yours." Melissa picked up her keys from where she had set them on the counter. She walked to the door and pulled it shut behind her with a precise, controlled click. Not a slam. Melissa never slammed. She was too composed for that, which somehow always made it worse. The apartment was quiet, except for the sound of the river. I picked up the photograph from the counter. I looked at the man in the high-vis vest, at the half-turned shoulder, at the framing of the houses behind him. Then I carried it out to the balcony where Brooke was standing with her arms wrapped around herself, looking at the water. I stood beside her, close enough that I could hear her breathing. The air off the Grand River was cold, and it smelled like November and wet leaves, and something I couldn't name. "The job site," I said. "That was November, 3 years ago?" She nodded. She was still looking at the river. "Why that day?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Melissa called me that week. She said you two were having a hard time. She said she didn't know if it was going to work." She paused. I drove out there and I sat in my car in the field access road for about 20 minutes. I watched you walk across the site and stop to look at something on a clipboard, and then you went over to one of the frames and you just ran your hand along the wood. Like you were checking for something, like you were just making sure it was right. She exhaled slowly, and then I took the photograph and I went home, and I didn't do anything with it. I just kept it. She had loved someone quietly and from a distance for years, in the same way she did everything, without announcing it, without making it anyone else's problem. And when her own sister had complained about that person, had rolled her eyes and called him boring, and said he didn't know how to let anyone in, Brooke had sat across the table and passed the dinner rolls, and kept her mouth shut and thought, "No, you just don't know how to look. I didn't come to take you from her," she said. "I came because it had been 2 years and I thought maybe I was finally allowed to try, if you wanted to." I didn't answer right away. I was looking at the photograph in my hands, at the man in the field, standing in the middle of something half-built, and I thought about how strange it is that the same quality in a person can be a wall to one woman and a reason to another. That my quietness, the thing Melissa had described as a closed door, was the thing Brooke had driven 40 minutes across Ontario to catch one photograph of. I placed the photograph back in Brooke's hand. "You should have said something," I said. "I know, years ago. I know that too." The river was moving below us, flat and dark, carrying the last of the autumn light toward Lake Erie. Neither of us said anything for a long time, and that was fine. That was more than fine. I went home that night. I went to work the next morning. I ate lunch in my truck in the site parking lot and looked out at the framing going up on the new row of houses and didn't call anyone. The day after that was ordinary in every external way. But that evening, sitting at my kitchen table with a half-eaten dinner in front of me and the city making its quiet November sounds outside the window, I picked up my phone and typed a message to Brooke. "Coffee tomorrow? I know a place near the river." She replied 11 minutes later. "I know the one. 7:30? I put my phone down and sat for a minute. Then I went and finished my dinner. It was the first meal in a long time that I didn't eat alone in any meaningful sense of the word. What followed was not a romance in the way movies mean when they use that word. There were no speeches, no airport runs, no rain. What there was this. A table at a coffee shop near the Cambridge Mill Pond where we met 2 or 3 mornings a week before my site started. Brooke always had her sketchbook, the long, narrow kind that landscape architects use, full of measurements and plant notations in handwriting so small I had to lean in to read it. I would bring a coffee from the counter and sometimes a butter tart from the bakery case, because she had mentioned once offhand that she'd grown up eating them on road trips, and they tasted like being a kid in the best way. I never forgot things like that. I'm not sure she realized that about me yet. We didn't define what we were doing. We didn't have a conversation about it. What we did was accumulate slowly and without making a project of it. One evening in December, I came to fix a baseboard heater that was cycling off too early, and when I left 3 hours later, I had stayed for dinner, and we had done the dishes side by side, without discussing whose job that was, and it had felt so ordinary that I drove home slightly unsettled by how much I didn't want to leave. By January, there was a spare key to her apartment on a hook by my door. By February, there was a coffee mug at her place that was mine without anyone saying so. Small things. The kind of things that don't announce themselves. The kind that, when you look back, you realize were the whole story. Melissa called one more time, late in February. Her voice was different, less calibrated. She asked if Brooke and I were serious. I said yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think I wanted to be right about both of you. I don't think I was." It was the most honest thing she had said to me in years and probably the hardest thing for her to say. I didn't know what to do with it entirely. I said thank you, and I meant it, even though I wasn't completely sure what I was thanking her for. Maybe for saying it, maybe just for knowing it was true. When I hung up the phone, I sat in my truck in the parking lot of the grocery store for a few minutes, looking at the fluorescent light coming through the automatic doors, and I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't realized was still suspended. 8 months later, Brooke and I moved into a place together, a house this time, a semi-detached in Galt, the older part of Cambridge, with a wide front porch and a backyard that needed work and radiator heating that made noises at night she found charming and I found familiar. We spent the first weekend painting the kitchen and arguing, in the comfortable way of people who like each other enough to disagree out loud, about the exact shade of white for the upper cabinets. She wanted warm. I wanted neutral. We ended up with something between them that neither of us had picked, and both of us liked better. I repainted the baseboards. She planted things along the fence in a sequence she had mapped on paper first, the way she did everything methodically, with a plan that left room for adjustment. On winter mornings, I shoveled the walk before she was up because she hated cold feet on wet pavement. She kept the good butter tarts from St. Jacob's Market in a tin on the counter and never said a word about it. One Saturday afternoon in March, a year after we moved in, I was fixing the back gate latch, which had been sticking since the fall. Brooke came out with 2 mugs of tea and sat on the back step and watched me work. I tested the latch 3 times before I put the screwdriver down, the same way I test everything. She didn't say anything about it, but I caught her smiling at something she wasn't going to explain. I sat down next to her on the step and took the mug. The backyard was just starting to show what she had planned for it. Shoots coming up along the fence, the dogwood she had planted in the corner already leafing out. She had spent years watching me from the edges of rooms, from the corners of holiday tables, from the driver's seat of a car parked at the edge of a field on a gray November afternoon. She had carried a photograph face down on her desk, so she could know it was there without having to explain why. She had moved her whole life 4 provinces east to a city she didn't know because it was 20 minutes from where I parked my truck every morning. And she had never said a word. Not one word. Until she had to. I set down my tea and looked at her for a moment. She looked back. "You know," I said, "you could have just called 2 years ago, or 3, or whenever." She considered this with the seriousness she gave to everything. "Maybe," she said, "but I didn't know if the timing was right, and now?" She picked up her mug, looked out at the yard, at the things growing along the fence that had been nothing but bare soil 6 months ago. "Now seems pretty good," she said. I picked up the screwdriver and put it back in the toolbox and closed the lid. The latch on the gate swung clean and easy, exactly the way it was supposed to. The yard was quiet except for a cardinal somewhere in the dogwood and the particular kind of Saturday afternoon silence that doesn't ask anything of you. Some things don't need to be announced to be real. Some things just need to be tended slowly, without making a production of it, until one day you look up and everything is exactly where it was always supposed to be.